Good morning, beautiful people. I'm Chris from Landlord Training Institute. We help income property owners manage their properties themselves without the stress of tenants and toilets or the ongoing expense of a property manager. This week's video is all about how to renovate and not lose your shirt. Let's get to it. Okay, so the first thing you want to think about when you're renovating a unit in order to rent it out is who are you going to rent it to? You need to know your ideal tenant profile. Spend some time thinking about who that's going to be and what they are going to want to see when they rent a place. If you can't answer what your ideal tenant profile is going to be looking for, you need to spend more time on that step, and you need to not buy anything until you can answer those questions. The reason you need to spend time on that is because every decision you make throughout the renovation process is going to be based off of who you are going to rent it to. Now, that doesn't mean that you disregard business decisions like how much something costs. It just means that when you're making those business decisions, you have to keep in mind what they're going to think about it. So if you've been following for a while, you know that my target demographic is 20-somethings. I always renovate with a 20-something in mind, and that's going to be different than if it was, say, a family in their 30s or a retiree. So my demographic being 20-somethings, they're going to have certain expectations and then certain experiences in their past that guide what they want right now. So it's not that hard to stand out as being a little bit better in a 20-something-year-old's eyes when what their experiences are from the past are renting from a big corporation where the baseboards and the walls are the same color. It's probably whatever base white is, and everything is very cheap. So what I try and do is create one piece of bling or one focal point or one thing that stands out in every single room. And you don't need more than one. This helps you keep costs in line when you're renovating, and it helps you stay cash flow positive while still setting you apart from a lot of the competition. So I'll give you some examples. In kitchens, generally an upgrade versus what they're used to is I do a tile backsplash. The easiest way to do a tile backsplash is to use subway tiles, but if you move from 3x6 subway tiles, which are the cheapest, most common, they're usually about 25 cents a piece tiles, all the way up to 3x12s, you're spending about 2 cents more per tile, and it looks a lot more expensive. You're going to spend maybe $10 or $15 more for that entire backsplash, and it looks a million times better. So it looks expensive, but it isn't. If you wanted to step it up even a notch from there, you could consider laying those tiles out as opposed to a brick pattern. You could do a chevron pattern. It's a lot more labor intensive, so you've got to keep that in mind, but it's definitely a step up as far as the visual appeal and the impact that it has. Now, depending on how deep your renovation is doing, staying in the kitchen, if you're setting new cabinets and you know you're doing a tile backsplash, if you're doing 3x12s and you set 3 or 4 rows of that, you can consider that if you were going to set those cabinets, say 13 inches above the countertop, maybe it works to drop them down to 12 and you won't end up cutting your subway tiles into a thin strip for the very top row. That row often gets hidden anyways, but for anybody across the room who's looking over, they're going to notice that, and it doesn't look as appealing as if everything lines up perfectly. So moving on to the living room. This is actually the easiest piece of bling that I ever do for my units, and I do it in every single one. What I do is I've got some old barn board that I pulled off an actual 100-year-old barn for free. I cut that into 27-inch lengths, and then I stack it vertically going from left to right. It's actually shiplap siding from a barn, so they actually fit into each other. I run them straight vertical from right to left on whatever feature wall makes the most sense. A 3.5-inch no profile baseboard is what I use all the time, and I just put a piece of that on top of it. It takes a total of maybe an hour to lay it out, and that's even including if there are receptacles on the wall or things like that you have to cut around. So you're into it for at most 1 hour time. Brad nails hold it on. People walk into the room, and because they've seen it on HGTV, they think that it's awesome. And it's easy and dirt cheap. Make sure you throw a level on that and stand back every now and then so that your boards are actually vertical as you move across the wall, but it's super easy to do. An upgrade from that might be using a geometric design on a feature wall. You can usually use something like 1 or maybe 2-inch trim pieces for that. You've seen this probably all over Instagram or whatever you might follow for renovations. Quite often that will be painted a different color as well, and it really makes that wall pop. So that's another thing you can do. It's a lot more time intensive, but it's actually not more expensive other than the labor aspect if you're paying for it, or your time if you're doing it yourself. Moving on to bedrooms. Bedrooms are super simple. All you're trying to do is create a little bit of impact, but then also teach them how to set their bed up. And I know that probably sounds strange, but you do a bit of a feature wall. It can even just be a slightly different shade of whatever color you're using in your house. Do a feature wall like that, a slightly different shade. It tells them where the headboard of their bed is supposed to be. Another thing that I like to do in bedrooms, and I do this in almost all of them because I do not provide AC in my units, is I throw a ceiling fan up. When you're using a ceiling fan, you want to think about how heavy it is. You want to also think about how much air it moves. It has to move some air for it to actually be a benefit, but at the same time, you don't necessarily want the biggest one you can find. I have used 48-inch ceiling fans in bedrooms before, and I can tell you in a 12 by 12 bedroom, that looks pretty big. The benefit of it is you can have it on the lowest speed possible and it still actually moves some air. So if people are quite warm at night, they can have it on the slowest speed. It's dead silent and it moves just enough air for it to cool off the room a little bit. You will find if you use a 48-inch fan in a bedroom that is a little bit on the smaller side, people will notice that it looks big. Some might find that off-putting, some may not, so your mileage may vary. Sticking on the topic of lights, lights in general are a dirt cheap way to have impact. You can have a light that looks fancy as can be, and it can be something like $200. That is cheap bling. My recommendation for what lights you use are either use regular A19 bulbs, which are the ones that you found in the light fixtures growing up. Probably every ceiling light was an A19, or else built-in LEDs that never need to be changed. When they burn out, you toss it. I also recommend don't go to Home Depot for lights, because even if you get what you think is nicer at Home Depot, it's going to be something they've seen 100 times before, and it's honestly probably junk. Go to an actual light store. They'll have a million options. They will understand that you don't want to spend $1 million, and they will help you out. They also, generally speaking, will keep a record of what you've bought, and as you scale up, you can phone them up and say, I need 6 more, and they know exactly what you're talking about. So if any of this is making sense, subscribe and hit the bell below. My last tip is don't go overboard when you're renovating. You have to create a budget prior, and you have to keep that budget in mind. That's not to say that you're going to hit that budget exactly, but don't just go out and buy a bunch of things and then figure out what you've spent afterwards. You have to, again, always think, maintain your cash flow, provide the highest impact for a reasonable budget that you can. And these tips that I've shared with you today should help you do that. I'm Chris from the Landlord Training Institute, and we help take the pain out of property management. I'll see you next week.